there are a lot of new and young people here, so I think we could say a few words. Dr. Uma Chakrabarti taught history at Miranda House in Delhi University. She's one of the most prominent figures in women's studies and a feminist historian. Some of her well-known books include Social Dimensions of Early Buddhism, The Life and Times of Pandita Ramabai, Gendering Caste Through a Feminist Lens. But she's also known as an activist who has been active in PUDR, in the democratic rights and the women's movement, and been in a part of many fact-finding teams. After the Gujarat riots, she was part of the International Tribunal of Justice, which heard the statements of many of the women victims of the Gujarat riots. She has investigated the situation of women in Kashmir earlier and also recently in Shopian. She has been very active in the Indian Association of Women's Studies, which has benefited from her sharp insights and guidance. At present, she is working on sexual politics in the Mahabharata. She is also making a film on women political prisoners, and she's been writing on impunity. We eagerly wait to hear her views and analysis on sexual violence in contemporary society and social impunity. So, on to Uma Chakrabarti.
I am quite delighted as well as honored to be speaking in the, as a speaker at the Anuradha Gandhi Memorial lecture. I don't think I met her, but I had friends who were very close to her, and from Susan's account just now, perhaps my friends actually met her when Anuradha went to Andhra for the famine work, because that's where my friend Sudesh Vaid, who was very active in the PUDR and also died very early, went as part of the attempt of trying to understand how even famine is something so deeply hierarchized in terms of how it affects people. So they were really close friends, and they were always meeting. Subbarao and Sudesh were very good friends of Anuradha, were often getting off at the station in Nagpur in order to go and meet her, because sometimes we would take the same train back from Hyderabad. And unfortunately, I don't think I met her, but I did go to her memorial meeting in JNU, where I think Susan had also come. So in some small way, I hope that what I have to say today furthers the kinds of issues that she was engaged with. And I know that she was interested in caste, and she was interested in gender, and these are two issues that for me are very critical, because class has its, let's say, has had a fair degree of writing from a long history of Marxist engagement. I don't think either caste or gender has had the same kind of sustained engagement from all democratic sections, not just from women or from people belonging to a caste. So I do believe that actually the entire democratic spectrum needs to engage with these two areas, which together, class, caste and patriarchy, make up the structural basis of inequality in our country. And I don't think if you do not put them all together, you really understand the peculiarities of the way in which these institutions are embedded in our society, and how difficult it is for us to actually disengage them. So it seems to me, or dislodge them. So it seems to me that everybody needs to engage with these three. And it's in this context that I will speak to you today about sexual violence, which is only one small section of the discussion that we need to have on patriarchy or on caste and patriarchy. And I'll begin, because this was suggested by the organizers, that I actually take the journey from what made sexual violence come on the map as far as recent times was concerned, and certainly for you, many of you young students, actually you must have noticed, you must have seen what the media managed to achieve and what students actually intervened in. If the December 16th, 2012 became what it did become, it was primarily because students responded to that horrible incident, and the media picked it up. But I also want to point out how the media, in a sense, is creating the events in history. And there are things that they will privilege and there are other things that they will completely ignore. And I think we need to understand that, even as we have a euphoric understanding of, oh, you know, the streets were filled with people after December 16th, I think we need to understand where the streets are filled, for what the streets are filled, and for what the streets are not filled. And you'll see that there is a lot that is missing in the way in which we engage with our own society. I'll start with, I'm going to begin this discussion with privileging, with this moment, this December event in Delhi. You take the very way it's framed. It's called, the woman who was assaulted brutally and who ultimately died. She has a name, and it's a name that has circulated in the subtext of our public sphere. But she was given certain names by the media. So this name Nirbhaya actually was given to her by the media, as was, for some reason, she was also called Damini. That is one who resisted her oppression, perhaps. And the very fact of these names standing for the experience that she had is significant, because, as I said, it's a way in which that particular assault was framed. We have had brutal assaults before, and we have continued to have brutal assaults thereafter. None of those have actually made it to the media in the same way as December 16th did. So how did it become such a big event? To start with, I think it's the resistance and the way in which students, primarily from JNU, began the agitation. They took the agitation to the center of Delhi, not to the little spot that is given for you to protest. Now, one of the things that we should understand, and I was told by somebody when we were traveling here together, that you have this place in Azad Maidan, which is like a little box, and that's the space for dharnas. We have a similar place in Delhi. It's on Janpath. It's on Jantar Mantar. Now, in the long history that I have lived through my times, we have had the entire what's it called, the Rajpath, crowded with agitations and for people like us. There were thousands of people who used to come as peasant demonstrators and so on from across from across India, who would from time to time take over these spaces and make their presence visible. We haven't seen anything like that, because we have now been confined, all protest has been confined to this little section of space. Since Elena is here, and there are many of you who were involved in many of these campaigns, I want to recall that we went once to the Chhattisgarh Bhavan. Chhattisgarh Bhavan we were supposed to be protesting outside Chhattisgarh Bhavan when Vinayak was in jail, and we were told that the demonstration has moved from here. You can't come here. And at that stage, the DMO someone called and said, move from here, otherwise we have orders to shoot to kill. I mean, that's the fear that they were putting into the demonstrators. So when I arrived, which was like 20 minutes late, there was no demonstration. It had disappeared. And then when I don't carry a mobile usually, so I went to a store and I called, and I discovered that it had moved. And where had it gone? It had gone to this place, Jantar Mantar, where you're confined in some back space and nobody ever engages with you. And I was fuming, I was furious. We had just read Ram Guha's India After Gandhi, in which he calls it a 50-50 democracy. And I was so fuming, I said, we have 30 square feet of democracy and it's in Jantar Mantar. What the hell is this guy talking about? So basically, we have actually put ourselves into a little box as far as our oppositional stance is concerned, because that's all that we are allowed. But the students from JNU, and I've taken this long digression, because the students did not confine themselves to Janpat. They spilled over to Vijay Chowk. Now Vijay Chowk is that, I don't know if you've seen it, you must have seen it at the time of the, when they were carrying those images. Vijay Chowk is just at the bottom of the seat of state power, which is the Secretariat. It's this huge space. It was here that they actually assembled, they shouted slogans, and the slogans were extremely interesting because it was also a free-for-all, because although the JNU students began this agitation, almost everybody who was angry about violence against women on the streets joined the agitation. So there was a popular response to this, to the beginnings of this agitation. So it was a mishmash. And while progressive sections actually had taken over the slogan from Kashmir, which is "Hum kya chahte azadi." This is a slogan which is very well known in Kashmir. It was being shouted in Vijay Chowk, but there were also other regressive slogans which indicated the spectrum that we had. But all of them, nevertheless, were treated with great brutality. They were water cannoned, even though there were large numbers. And for the first time in recent history, this state was shaken. It was quite, in some ways, it was a bit strange. What were the students asking for? They were saying, Rahul Gandhi must come and talk to us. Now, I couldn't see the logic of that, but Rahul Gandhi needed to come and talk to them. So the students are actually responding in ways which maybe it was a populist way in which they were saying, he's a youth leader, let him come and speak to us. If he thinks that he's going to be the leader of tomorrow, then he should engage with us. Of course, nothing happened on that front. And this brutal reaction was one aspect. So one of the things that was interesting was but the progressive slogans were also there, as I said. So say, for instance, young women took to the streets and had banners which said, "Don't tell me what to wear. Teach your sons not to rape." Now, so there was a whole way in which you were reconstituting the discourse around women and rape, because generally the blame is put on women and they are treated as, in some way they provoked them. And it is up to us to go on saying to them, look, this 2-year-old child has been raped, this 60-year-old woman has been raped, it has nothing to do with what you wear. But actually, it is not something that hit a mark till these young women did actually say this very angrily. They had these very powerful ways in which they were engaging with the media and with the public. So that was interesting. And how did the state react? They shut the metros down on a particular day because they thought that all the people were going to crowd over there. So for the first time, a question which is central to gender and to understanding patriarchy, which is the violence against women, and I want to emphasize this, violence against women is as central to patriarchy as violence against the dominated sections is against in class. Violence is actually a structurally inherent in unequal institutions, and we must never forget that, so that actually patriarchy can only survive through ultimately using violence, although sometimes women conform just through the fear of violence. But here's this very, as I said, very visible evidence of the violence, and the very panic-stricken way in which the state responded, because it shut. I mean, imagine trying to prevent people from emerging and congregating in the Vijay Chowk. by shutting down the metros. So in some sense, that was an interesting thing. Now the positive thing of all of that, the negative thing, first let me talk about the positive. The positive thing in all of this is that although the media, which always hypes things up and only picks up the things that they want to pick up, and then, as you know, the whole style is, Arnab Goswami will never let you speak unless you're saying what he wants to hear, and he'll shut you up in the middle of a sentence. He does that, and it's extraordinary, the badgering that he does. But one of the things that was being constantly touted on but he was also collecting some, sort of speakers. And it was interesting to find that there were a few people who came on screen and began to suddenly talk about patriarchy. Now this was very interesting because nobody had ever spoken about patriarchy as patriarchy. So, and it was coming from these male academics from JNU, but there's patriarchy, and I want to really, it was really quite hilarious because these are guys that we have been, the women's movement and feminists have been writing for at least 35 years. Nobody reads us, you can be sure, except in women's studies courses, where things are forced to read us. But for the rest, these guys don't read us. So and now suddenly they're talking about patriarchy. So what's this? This is really an extraordinary moment in media history, at least. But at the same time, there were very regressive things which were also happening. And one of them was this death to the rapists. And it was like so you had Zinda Lash on the one hand, that is the dead woman is finished, she's got no life, that's it, and anger coming on that count. And on the other hand, it was death to the rapists. Now, this has never been something that the women's movement has asked for. We've stood against it. But most importantly, I think it was interesting that what did you need to do, and I want to focus on that. In the middle of this mad, passionate, let's say, outburst that you saw in the media and in the public sphere, there was a very interesting cautionary piece that was written by Nilanjana Mukhopadhyay. I wonder if you all remember it. It was within I think the week of the call for death to the rapists, or within 3 days. And she did this extremely powerful rendering of, she said, who all are you going to give the death penalty to? Are you going to give it to the fathers, to the uncles, to the relatives in the home who abuse, who rape women? Are you going to give it to the landlord who rapes his? Are you going to give it to the dominant castes who rape the women who come to work for them? Are you going to give it to the soldiers who are involved in rapes in the borders? And it's that actual way of framing that was extremely important. And I want to focus on that. It's not that Nirbhaya or Damini was the first woman to be raped, and as I said, she's certainly not. Very, very soon we've seen that there have been so many rapes after that. So in a sense, what is important in the middle of all this extremely loaded and emotional rhetoric around sexual violence, which is actually not even seriously engaging with sexual violence. For instance, I don't know if any one of these people has engaged with patriarchy as an institution, as a structural fault line. I'm not sure any one of them is thinking about the relationship between caste and patriarchy, for instance, and the ways in which that actually is so significant in reproducing the map of inequality in India. So while all that is not there, there is a need for us to engage with this seriously. Now, fortunately, it managed to happen. For at least 30 years, as I said, we'd all been writing, we had been, we had actually written on many issues. Feminist scholars, democratic rights activists had focused on many issues that did come up at this point. So one of the things that happened is that when the quiet came back, no, it didn't come back so easily. You could see, there was a sort of competitive populism that you could see. So parties were rushing to go meet the family. They were promising all kinds of things. The state was also, its immediate response is to do two things. One is to announce a whole series of compensations. And it is very interesting because every single male member of Nirbhaya family was given a job. So one of the brothers was actually negotiating for a job as a pilot, and it got into some difficulty because he said, not only should I be trained as a pilot, but I should also be promised a job as a pilot, and that was something that they couldn't easily do. My point is that rapes happen elsewhere, they don't get the same response, because here was every single political formation was rushing off and trying to stoke this event because it had captured the public imagination. But when quiet settled down and when it looked like justice was going to proceed, it got reduced to give the death penalty to all the rapists. There was a lot of hype around the young boy who's less than 18, who was one of the people involved in the attack on her, that should he or should he not be given, and I think there was a lot of anger around that. But by and large, it settled down. And then the government, as governments are wont to do, appointed a committee. And they appointed the Justice Verma Committee. Now, the Justice Verma Committee could have been like every other committee, which, as you know, it's a standard policy by the state to diffuse a volatile situation, is to appoint a commission. That commission doesn't even usually go into action. It doesn't sit, and when it sits, it goes on for years and years and years. You know that. I mean, the Nanavati Commission in Gujarat and some other. Nanavati Commission in Gujarat has got one more extension. So we keep hearing when they get an extension, but we don't see the report itself. In a strange way, this Verma Committee was given a 60-day or a 90-day brief to present their report. It was an attempt at trying to say that, look, we are serious. And it began like other committees. It announced that it was going to receive submissions from across the country, from anyone who wanted to send them a submission. Now, it was incredible because it was flooded. It was actually completely overwhelmed with the submissions that went. I think there was something like 30,000 submissions that the committee received. It was like they were inundated with these, and everybody who's sitting over here will know that in some way or the other, we were all involved in sending these submissions because you wanted a serious engagement on the issue. It was wider than simply the sexual violence that had hit the public eye. It opened up a whole series of questions. But anyway, these submissions, now, it could have also stopped at that. But feminist lawyers somehow managed to push this and say, you can't stop at just receiving the submissions, you've got to face the women's groups. So women's groups need to actually come and talk to you. And we had a two-day very intense interaction with the committee. And every single thing that we had been thinking of in all those years, the continuum of sexual violence that we had all been focused on, saying there's a continuum of violence which begins in the sacredness of the home, it goes out into the street, it goes into the fields, and it is there in your borders. It's there in the areas where the army is deployed. So there's this huge continuum, and all of that needs to be addressed. When the Verma Committee agreed to meet with women's groups, actually women's groups came from across the country. And they came from every area with every single issue that could be focused on. So for instance, this was the moment in which questions of sexual violence for the LGBT community for the first time appearing before a high power committee of this kind. Equally, there were representatives from the Northeast and from Kashmir who brought in their own particular issues. So it was actually quite a significant way in which the complex nature of the sexual violence was sought to be brought before the Verma Committee. Now, what the result of this, of course, was that the Verma committee, on the whole, it took the submissions reasonably well. I think they got harangued a little bit. There was a bit of anger. The one place where they really felt very uncomfortable was when the Kashmiri woman spoke, because she was very blunt and straightforward, and I think the committee couldn't handle that. I mean, they were just wanting to close the discussion quickly, because they were really uncomfortable with that. But she made her point, and it stayed. And when the committee actually provided its sort of recommendations, many of the radical things that we had said were included in the Verma committee recommendations. It included pretty radical things like AFSPA should not be a reason for not proceeding civilly in a rape case. It included marital rape. So the continuum actually acknowledged that marital rape was a very significant issue, and it needed to be addressed. So from marital rape, that is the home, all the way to the borders, the entire range of issues was in some ways taken. I think they were a little weak on the caste question, but by and large, they did respond positively to many of the things that we had presented as submissions. So this was an interesting moment. Of course, we all knew that when the criminal law amendment bill would come, now it was a euphoric moment. Once Verma presented the findings, we thought that, okay, this big, huge battle that we've waged for over 30 years, somewhere has borne fruit. But I, of course, I'm, I suppose, a hopeless pessimist, but I was quite convinced that we were not going to get two things. And those were precisely the two things that we did not get, which is no acknowledgement for marital rape, no lifting of the AFSPA, no challenging of the impunity that the AFSPA gives. The AFSPA doesn't actually give impunity for rape. The AFSPA only gives you impunity for the what they consider to be what will you put it as, the right to invade your homes and carry away things over there. In a sense, encounters get covered by the AFSPA, but it's interesting, rape is not in the line of duty. You do not rape in the line of duty. There is nothing that says that you can rape a woman in these areas and that you will be covered by AFSPA. But AFSPA is so powerful as a larger rubric that we haven't had rape cases tried except under court-martials. So in a sense, and I'm going to come back to that at the end, but I will leave it for the moment. So the two things that we did not, I knew were not going to come. These are the sacred cows of our state as well as our society. Marital rape, who's going to acknowledge marital rape? You know, I mean, because what do you mean by marital rape? There's a sexual contract, and a man has a right to a woman's body. So that's it. So as far as that's on one end, and of course, this is the other holy cow is the AFSPA. What is interesting in the discussions that we were having, because we had a round of discussions again on the media at that stage, was that it was strange, but it was army generals who suddenly began to talk about marital rape also. Now, what is, I couldn't quite, it was, the army generals were talking about the marital rape, and they were also talking about the fact that AFSPA was a holy document. AFSPA was a holy law. So you couldn't challenge it. It was almost being given the value of a holiness beyond the Constitution. So it's, you know, it's like incredible. But this was what people were saying, and I think they got the connections quite well. The two sacred spaces, supposedly, is the nation and the borders, what happens within it, and the other is the home, and surely you can't police the home. So really, I think that it was quite an interesting configuration. It was accidental, I didn't expect it, but that is how it was presented in the on the press. I've gotten used to the army generals coming along and saying things on the media. They get quite angry, and Arnab Goswami knows how to stoke that anger. So, okay, now I think let's move to how do we see this? Is the Verma Committee, its better findings being implemented anywhere at all? They were actually wanting to put protocols into place as far as police stations are concerned, going to it, being able to, file an FIR without obstruction and so on. I don't think any of that has dramatically changed. But there are feminists over here, they might be able to tell us whether there has been any change following this. Clearly, sexual violence has not ended. If anything, there is an upsurge of reporting, at least. There may be an upsurge of actual acts, but there's also an upsurge of reporting. And there began to be critiques and angry critiques of the December 16th and the agitation around December 16th. And the first serious critique really came from caste groups, because they said, look, what is this? I mean, there was this absolutely horrendous, brutal Khairlanji. Khairlanji never made a discussion in the media, not at least in the Delhi media. And it wasn't as if the media was not present, wasn't active at that stage. It was vicious and brutal. Those women, what were they doing? They were simply exercising their right to file an FIR. That's it. That's all they did against the upper castes in their village, for which the mother and daughter were picked up, brutally raped, stripped. The son was also actually hit clearly in his private parts. So it was actually a very brutal reaction by the upper caste for actually the right, a constitutional right, which was all that was being exercised, that led to this horrendous reaction. It was something that actually we have to hold ourselves accountable for, because there wasn't enough of a noise. And as it's happened, again, the ploy of and the worst part of it is that in Khairlanji, neither the Sexual Violence nor the Prevention of Atrocities Act was actually acknowledged. So the sexual violence was erased from it because there was complicity by the administration, and similarly, the fact that it was a caste-based assault on the family was also erased. And when you erase those, the political meaning of that particular sexual violence is lost. After that, if you say death to the rapists, death to the killers, it doesn't mean anything, because the High Court will drop it. I'm not against the end to the death penalty. I am for the end to the death penalty. But the fact is, on what grounds do you actually commute? And that is a very interesting history. If you look at why they're commuting, I think it's an interesting situation. But most importantly, what is actually very significant is that there has been now recently a huge number of rapes that are taking place in Haryana. And they are of upper caste, of the Jats, against Dalit girls. And it is happening in case after case after case. These are happening in and around, not far from Delhi. And there is something clearly very complex in the way in which changes in the political economy are happening. I think we need to understand both the workings of caste, but also the workings of caste and land control at a time when neoliberal policies have been unleashed in that area. Delhi is, Gurgaon is next to Delhi. There's huge urban boom. There's urban boom in all the small towns in Haryana, and lands are being taken over by sort of for malls, for all kinds of urban developments. it is actually bringing huge amounts of cash into the hands of the younger generation of the Jats who haven't lost out on their old social relationships. So land remains primarily in the hands of the Jats, social power is in the hands of the Jats, and the Dalits are conventionally agricultural laborers, and the whole balance is has been somewhat, let's say, tinkered with questions like reservation and education, which the Dalits are using as a means of being able to get out of the oppressive social relations of the village. So actually you'll find that the urbanization and is having uneven effects as far as different communities are concerned. And a lot of Dalit girls are going to school. A lot of Dalit boys are going to school too. But this is one of the things. And in recent years, actually there's been a number of acts of resistance by Dalit groups in Haryana. So starting off from Dulina, you might remember that incident where supposedly four Dalits were lynched because they were supposed to have slaughtered a cow, which was all a complete rumor, which is I think in 2003 or 4 that happened. Gohana, where where Dalits have moved into small towns and are running little sort of independent occupations. So in all of this, the idea that the Dalits are actually moving out from these conventional relationships of Naukri and Siri, these are two relationships that are very strongly embedded in the region. It's the equivalent of bondage. It's low wages. So this is, on the one hand, that's the attempt of the Jats, the upper caste to dominate, the OBC communities to dominate the Dalits. On the other hand, the Dalits are trying to move out from these oppressive social relations. This has led to a lot of, stoked fears on the part of the Jat communities, who have begun to use the Khap Panchayats as a very regular way of policing women. You must have heard about, there's a silly term called honor killing, which I hate because it has nothing to do with honor and should be dumped straight away. I call it custodial killing because these are all happening in the custody of the family. Families are in custody of their daughters, and when they kill them, it's a form of custodial violence. I refuse to concede any other that any other term can capture that oppressiveness of that situation. But anyway, intercaste marriages between Jat girls and Dalit boys is something that drives people into closing ranks and holding these Khap Panchayats, which then order. Actually, the state is not the only place which is giving the death penalty to people. Families are giving the death penalty to people. Let's be clear. Sazaye Maut is being levied on erring women. If you cross the boundaries, then you die. You die for daring to make an intercaste marriage. Let's understand the brutality for what it is. Let's understand the structure for what it is. Let's not give it any nice little, thing that kisi ki izzat par aanch aaya. It's brutal power being used by families. So this is happening. Now these are some of the ways in which communities have begun to exercise their power. And one of the things that's very scary to the upper castes over there is, if these marriages are allowed to survive, it changes the land relations in the area, because daughters can now inherit. And if they marry Dalit boys and they actually claim their lands, you dislodge the relationship between caste and patriarchy as it has existed through the endogamous marriage. It means it's a challenge to that structure. And if it's done for, Ambedkar said this, that, the only way to break the caste system is to have, to end the endogamous marriages. This is what is actually the fear that has been generated in Haryana. Now, that's not the only form of violence that is being practiced. The very same panchayats, those Khap Panchayats, have suddenly begun to be used now, interestingly, in these attacks that are being mounted on young girls, school-going girls, who are, leaving their homes to go to school, because the whole configuration of land, power and caste is being somewhat transformed through these new dynamics that are happening, and it is seen as a way in which labor, their control over the Dalits is going to be reduced. One of the taunts of the Jats to the Dalits is that they are jamais of the government. They say, because reservation is supposed to be something that they have access to. But they are also very crude in some ways, and they say, "Pehle hamari naukriyan, ib hamari betiyan," which means first you start with the jobs, and now you are poaching on our girls. And they are in a bad situation because they are systematically practicing female sex-selective abortion, so their sex ratios have fallen, they're in short supply as far as women are concerned. So there's a completely anarchic way in which patriarchy functions, but it also finds its solution. So their girls are coming now, they're importing brides from Kerala and from other places, but equally they're also doing things of this kind, which is like there's this hype around Bahu, the girls who could be your daughters-in-law, and they are being taken away by these lower castes. So actually, there's really strange dynamics being played out in some of these areas. Now, it's in case after case, it was quite. It's really horrible because young girls are going on their way to school, they are picked up, gang raped, videos are made. And then as the videos circulate on the mobile, it comes back to the family. In one tragic situation, a father saw this video, went home, couldn't bear the humiliation and committed suicide. So it's like a horrible state of affairs as far as the viciousness with which the predatory behavior of young men is being unleashed upon young Dalit girls. Now, at the same time, what's extraordinary is there is some media attention. So we went to one village. It was quite extraordinary. The girl had been taken to Goa to speak at the Think Fest. She was speaking at Goa at the Think Fest at the same time that Tarun Tejpal was, engaged in what he was doing. It's quite, how bizarre can contemporary India be? It's the same situation being played out, and she's flown out, asked to speak over there, brought back. She's exactly where she was. The case, they have lost the case. The rapes have not been upheld. Her mother actually was protecting her, and the mother was also sexually raped, and then acid was thrown on her face to disfigure her. This is the reality of that girl who went to the Think Fest and back. And the case is the lower court has closed, has let the absconders go. So there's as I said, there's this bizarre way in which you can see the manifestation of sexual violence and what the media is doing with it. Now, around this is questions of land struggles. For instance, Bagana, people from Bagana were in a land struggle for the last 3 years. As punishment for the land struggle, 4 of the girls from that village were picked up, sedated, raped, and then dumped in the railway station. That group is also sitting for 3 months in the Jantar Mantar, in the infamous Jantar Mantar, which nobody pays any attention to. And not a single person has come to speak to them. Not a single person is addressing them. So you can see how uneven and how, how skewed the way civil society is responding to these rapes, or the media is responding to these rapes. Now, I do want to cover some other issues before I start to sum up. Muzaffarnagar. It's an extremely depressing situation. Those of us who were all, some of us have watched this the centrality of sexual violence to the right-wing agenda for a very long time. But after Gujarat, when it really hit the public eye in a huge way, we did hope at that stage, and we worked very hard to bring the communal violence bill into place. And the only way we could have actually put some notion of accountability and some way to challenge the impunity which perpetrators and crowds have enjoyed conventionally in a riot situation was by holding the state accountable through its officials. Now, for 5 years, many of us sat and worked on that communal violence bill. But in the end, it was introduced and dropped very quickly, because who in the political spectrum that we have is interested in accountability? Who is interested in justice? Neither the party in power nor the opposition, because they are busy cancelling out one sexual violence against another. You must have heard this, when 2002 happened, all the BJP and the Gujarat, and you remember the famous statement made by, what's his name, George Fernandez, on the floor of the parliament. It was so gross that it had to be excised from the records of the parliamentary proceedings. But one of the things he said is, what's new about rapes? There have always been rapes. You get those kind of statements, but you have this. You had rapes in 1984, and you have, so if there are rapes in 2002. So these people, these political formations, just play this slanging match against each other, and one is supposed to cancel out the other. And there are hordes of us sitting outside it, also actually talking about the very same, and we are not in any formation. So some of us have written on 1984, and we continue to write on 2002, and then we continue to write on 2013 or 14 or whatever it is. So we are the stable conscience of this utterly crude state. But basically, that's how interested political groups are. And so, Muzaffarnagar, what has it done? It's reached a new high. It's competitive electoral politics of the worst order. Because what is the slogan? You are just basically, each of those formations is trying to gain. UP is extremely important. If you get the 90 seats in UP, you get to sitting in Delhi. That's how important UP is. So UP must have riots. How can you not have riots in UP? And that's exactly what happened. And the new phenomenon is not to have large killings, because if you have large numbers of killings, then the people get agitated. You have a few killings, but you have massive dislocation. And that's what happened in Muzaffarnagar. The number of killed is 40 or 45 or 50. The dislocation is thousands. The fear that was generated was incredible. I mean, those of us who had to hear these accounts of what happened in Muzaffarnagar, it's like sleepless nights, because there's this horribly poignant account of a mother who was fleeing with her little child in a bundle to some safe zone, and when she reached that place, she discovered the child was not in the bundle. You can imagine what that meant to that mother. That's the kind of fear, that's the kind of atmosphere in which they're functioning. There's no rule of law, there is no state, and each one is simply playing games in order to consolidate. And what has precipitated it? It was a small incident of a so-called brushing of one guy by another belonging to two communities that was created into it always has to be into an assault on a woman, because assault on the woman has to be central in anything that you're creating, because women's izzat has to be honored. And supposedly that was the issue that led to the event. That girl said nothing ever happened. So the girl who was implicated in it, she said nothing ever happened, and yet a huge Mahapanchayat was allowed to happen, and it was announced as a Bahu Beti Bachao Sammelan. And this Bahu Beti Bachao is this emotive rhetoric around the sexual purity of your own community is used to actually stoke the communal cauldron. And at the same time, there is actually an event There are rapes that have happened. There are large numbers of rapes that have happened. They have not been documented. Only 6 FIRs have been filed. And it is and why are FIRs not filed? Why do women not file? One of the lessons we learned in Gujarat was that it is not that they are necessarily worried about the rape becoming public. It is actually about the fact that they do not believe that they will get justice. And so if there's no transparency, there's no possibility of justice, what's the point of going this long route? Because everybody knows it's public. The rapes are public. The perpetrators know, the families know, the wider community knows, and yet you do not file reports. There are 6 FIRs that have been filed. There's incredible pressure on these women to withdraw. Incredible coercion for them to withdraw. We don't know where this is, going to end. And so, in one sense, the accountability and impunity question is not something that has moved at all from any of the stuff that we did. In Badaun, there's a very strange twists and turns. Now the CBI is saying there was no rape. And I'm not surprised, because this is exactly what they said in Shopian. The CBI came on the scene and then said that the post-mortem was fudged. The post-mortem was a lie. So, and who does the post-mortems? It's all under the state. It's all under the state machinery. How will you ever find something that can actually lead to, and nobody has integrity. Everybody is under the rubric functioning under their political masters. So at the end of the day, do we believe that actually any institution is outside of this coercive structure? So it's a very it's a chilling situation to think where this kind of thing is going to end. And of course, then let's move to the borders. So there was this Jammu and Kashmir, there's the AFSPA, there's starting from 91 and the infamous Kunan Pushpara case, where a whole village was subjected to sexual violence. The Press Council, in its first act of high nationalism, went off and came back after a half-an-hour visit to the place under B.G. Varghese, who tries to pass himself off as a civil rights man. It's a tragic irony on our part. But he does. He comes to meetings and we don't know what to do, whether we should march out from there or not. But this is what he did. He actually came back and said there were no rapes because the girls were laughing. I mean, this is ridiculous. This is a way to malign the army, and nothing happened. Now, okay, this is a village that is, nothing happened, but it's stigmatized. Nobody will marry into that village. Okay, so nothing happened, it's a ghost event, but the stigma is real. So what kind of peculiarity are we living through? That's one thing. But fortunately now, I'm glad to say, and then of course Shopian happened. Now when Shopian happened, they learned their lesson very well. So they manipulate right from the beginning. So as the event happens, the machinery goes into action. So the post-mortem, first they put out the theory of drowning. When that doesn't work, drowning in a nala, in which we have a photograph of a girl, of a woman standing in the nala. The water doesn't even go into her ankles, and the 2 women are supposed to have drowned. That photograph, as part of our fact finding, we put it up on the internet. It went all over the on the internet. Immediately there was, what was it called? What is the word? What's the expression? I'm not getting it. But anyway, there was an attempt at trying to recalibrate that situation, and so we have someone who gets his information from the RAW and from the army, who came out and said, no, the drowning didn't happen there. It happened upstream in a much higher spot, and then the bodies just floated down. So you had to put these theories into place because it was so patently a lie. Now, we may think that these events die, But Shopia was followed the next year by the huge popular upsurge. You all know young people came on the streets as part of the resistance, the famous stone pelters of... and they then began to demand an end to the AFSPA. Actually, the new slogan there was, "Hum kya chahte? Azadi from the AFSPA." So AFSPA's Azadi was narrowed down, at least at starting point is end of the AFSPA. So that was an interesting formulation. But most significantly, what we now see is that people who were involved in the cover-up in Kunan Pushpara have come public. So there's the district officials who was told to shut up and not allow this information to leak. Wajahat Habibullah, who ultimately became the information commissioner, the Right to Information Commissioner, he has had to defend himself and say, why he said what he did. So actually, one good thing is that things do not actually get erased from public memory. They stay, they fester over there, and they come out in some form. And what is really interesting is that 50 women from across generations have filed a mass petition to not close the Kunan Pushpara case, to reopen to let it function, and that's a matter that is pending. Now, 24 years down or 23 years down the line, the event is still something that is not being allowed to die, and that's the positive thing as far as this short interest of public memory is concerned. And then to go to the Northeast, I do want to close on the Northeast. Yesterday was the 10th year of Manorama's brutal killing and her murder, the sexual violence and the murder. Amu is here somewhere, and I'm very glad to see that. But I remember this thing that when the killing itself took place, when Manorama was shot and raped and shot, and there was an outrage in the public in the Northeast, in Manipur, one young man actually immolated himself. He was so horrified by what had happened. It still didn't hit mainland India. Nobody paid too much attention to it in mainland India. The Northeast is out there. They're all a bunch of insurgents. Why do we want to do anything with them at all? And then those older women went before the Kangla fort, stripped, and held that banner which said, "Indian Army, come and rape us." That is actually the thing, and the mobile revolution had happened. That's the thing that actually was circulated. It is only then that the rest of India sat up and paid any attention at all. Because it's the shame of that triggered them off. It is actually the Mashweta Devi's story of Draupadi, who comes before the policeman, refuses to clothe herself and said, "What can you do? All you can do is to counter me." And she says, it's that kind of thing that has to be done in order to shock the conscience of this nation, which can allow brutalities and indignities to be heaped in different parts of the country. So it is only that, and only then. And what is this about? And then, of course, there was this discussion about AFSPA will be removed, Jeevan Reddy committee is appointed, Jeevan Reddy committee gives its recommendations, it sits in cold storage. But more interestingly, the Manipur government actually appointed a commission of inquiry into the Manorama incident. Now here's where the relationship between the army and civil society, civil administration comes in. So the army immediately challenged the state government's right to appoint a commission of inquiry. Can you believe it? Can those of you who are still some believers in the rule of law actually believe this? This is what the state government was faced with, a reaction from the army which said you can't actually, you cannot hold an inquiry into the acts of the army. Civil government, the Manipur government could not do this. Fortunately, it went to a court of law, it was adjudicated, and there was a judgment that said that the Commission of Inquiry is valid. So Colin Gunn, the Human Rights Law Network, actually managed to get that. But what is the state of that report? It's buried. Nobody knows what's written in the Commission of Inquiry. So, as far as Manorama is concerned, there is no justice under the system. And all acts, including sexual violence, is going into is being administered not by constitutional law, not by the administrative law, the general administration, but by the equivalent of a martial law administration, because it is only taken cognizance of in court-martials. Now, why should a citizen of the country, a woman citizen who's raped, be subject to a court-martial? Court-martial, if you have quarrel between two army types, you can go to a court-martial. Why should a woman citizen who has nothing to do with the army be tried and given justice under a court-martial court? And we know from the Patribal judgment, which you've all seen, that ultimately nothing will come out of that also. The court-martials will be able to manipulate the evidence. It's not a transparent system. It is not acceptable to many of us who are wanting to challenge the impunity for sexual violence at every location that happens. So in that sense the term. And so here is the Northeast with Sharmila on a 14-year fast to lift the AFSPA. I mean, it's an extraordinary situation. So here's this woman sitting on fast. She is held against her will in a hospital, virtually in jail because nobody is allowed to meet her. And that is one person who's asking for the martial law, asking for the AFSPA to be lifted. You can see the interesting configuration. When the Anna Hazare movement happened, Sharmila asked whether, her fast was going to get a response. When the Aam Aadmi Party said it was putting up candidates, one of the questions they were asked is about the AFSPA. So actually the AFSPA is currently in some way it is being examined, and it's somewhere it is being contested, and it is something that's important. So there is a difference in the way in which at this point of time we are poised. And if anyone is serious about addressing the problem of sexual violence, you'll have to address it at every single location, at every single place. So police torture, Soni Sori, police torture, torture under police in police custody, it is something quite extraordinary. I don't think a case like this has hit the public eye. What are we going to do with it? How do we actually challenge the impunity of state officials so we want actually justice across the board, and we begin from the home and we will end. We must demand it at the borders. That's the only way that that democratic groups and women's rights groups will actually accept that the state is serious about ending the sexual violence against women. Otherwise, it's simply rhetoric. It's simply so many crores for the Nirbhaya Center, so many whatever it is. I think that's all sops that are happening. It's become now, interestingly, it has become an issue in politics. So everybody's talking about women's safety. Never mind what the record of these groups are as far as women's safety is concerned. I think that's where we stand, and that's where I think all of us need to put our energies. Young people, older generation people, everyone. What kind of society do we want to live in? What kind of justice do we expect from simply demanded under the constitutional provisions? Nothing more than that. Thank you.
Thank you, Uma, for bringing out the various dimensions of sexual violence and for showing how it is an inherent part of the social and political fabric. And I am especially happy that you have chosen this topic, because in the series of lectures at the Anuradha Gandhi Memorial, we haven't had a lecture that focuses on sexual violence, on gender and caste. And this was one of the topics on which Anuradha wrote extensively. So I think it's a very suitable tribute for her. साथियों, हमने उमा जी से अनुरोध किया था कि वो हिंदी में भी कुछ बोले, लेकिन शायद अधिकतर यहाँ अंग्रेज़ी समझते हैं और वक्त के कारण वो नहीं बोल पाई। लेकिन जब खुली चर्चा होगी, आप कोई स्पष्टीकरण चाहते हो तो हिंदी में पूछ सकते हो और उमा जी ज़रूर हिंदी में जवाब देगी। Now I would like to actually hand over the proceedings to Dr. Vibhuti Patel, who is chairing this session. Everybody in Bombay, of course, knows Dr. Patel. She is the professor and head Department of Economics in the SNDT Women's University and a well-known economist who writes on gender and developmental and industrial economics. She has done a postdoctoral fellowship from the London School of Economics and written extensively on declining sex ratio and gender and youth. She is part of the Anusandhan Trust. Her book, Girlhoods at the Threshold of Youth and Gender, is well known. In the 70s, when Vibhuti was younger, she was very active in the trade union and working class movement, in the railway strike of 74, and in the women's movement in Forum in Bombay. At present, she has been working on drawing up a social and economic profile of Muslims in Maharashtra, and in many ways she has contributed to research, to the women's movement and working class movement in India. So firstly, I request Vibhuti to say a few words as the chairperson of this session, and then to throw the discussion open.
Thank you, Shoma. Friends, I am really overwhelmed by Dr. Uma Chakravarty's thorough analysis and critical reflection on today's highly debated issue of sexual violence. We have been co-travelers in the women's movement. Many of us here in this hall also worked with Anuradha Shanbhag, and we know that caste and gender were two of the very important concerns of her. I was new to Bombay. It was Anuradha who made me member of Committee for Protection of Democratic Rights. We have editor of CPDR's journal, Mouthpiece, Raksha, Jyoti Punwani is here. We know that right from the very beginning, in the post-emergency period, when Raksha was brought out, it always gave very seriously examined the question of sexual violence. We feminists differed with them. We considered sexual violence as a barbaric form of, extreme form of patriarchal control over women's bodies to keep them in the permanent state and perpetual state of terrorization, humiliation and subjugation, while their vantage point was a class struggle that in a capitalist development or in a semi-feudal state, semi-feudal, semi-capitalist state, the primitive accumulation of capital where the polarization of classes takes place, where sexual violence becomes, the account is settled over woman's body. Whatever may be the differences, that time we used to discuss in a very volatile fashion, but there was always honesty of purpose, and that's why I think all of us are here. The most important issue which she brought out, I think it was also the whole reflection on the debate during 80s. What is the difference between what anti-Mathura rape case, anti-rape movement in the 80s and anti-rape movement in the 90s? I think at that time, though there were massive protests, thousands of women throughout the country came out, but the understanding on question of sexual violence, which I saw in 2013, and especially those young boys and girls, the way they were discussing on media and writing, and the most serious writings on sexual violence in last 3 years have come up from these men. I don't know all these men, Haldankar and others, but the sensitivity and the empathy with which they have deconstructed the issue of sexual violence, I think that is the understanding, and I think it's a collective endeavor of both women's movement and women's studies. For past 35 years, women's studies has penetrated in the women's in the academia, not only in corner of Research Center for Women's Studies within the university system, but there has also been mainstreaming of women's studies within syllabi. So each and every discipline, several universities have introduced foundation course, and I think maybe that is the culmination. Earlier, whenever we used to discuss sexual violence, I think Gurbir was the only revolutionary I know who invited Maitreyi Krishnaraj and myself to discuss sexual violence in their study circle. But I don't think any of the political bodies or organizations that used to discuss. Now you see young boys invite you to discuss the issue. When after Nirbhaya episode, when the protests were taking place almost every day, 2, 3, 4 demonstrations used to be there in all the suburbs. All these kids were talking only about castration and capital punishment. When we went into argument with that, they were ready to listen. So many of them, I think this is one achievement that I see, that these are the torchbearers of future struggles for women's safety. I see that, and I see hope there. Because there is a seriousness about it. Is not treated in a trivial fashion. Even the mainstream media is now careful about trivializing this issue of sexual violence. Yeah, because earlier there would be always cartoons and very frivolous level of argument, which is not happening. Another very important thing is that about the Priyanka Bhutbange case, what was happening at the ground level. For the first time you saw girls in school uniforms, and without informing their parents, they were doing Rasta Roko and Dharnas and demonstration courting arrest. And that new spirit that you see among young Dalit girls, and I can get, because I teach in Women's University, and the level of militancy that you see, I think they are new. They are Malalas. What Malala is doing in her context, I think these young girls, they also have a very strong fire within them. And this whole slow Shakti Meal episode, when it happened in Mumbai, where a young photojournalist was gang raped, this thing. And the response after that, I think in most of the educational institutions, girls and boys were discussing this issue. When Akshara organized safety audit, I think in hundreds of volunteers they managed to get, in the question of safety became very serious. The way urbanization is taking place, so many dangerous places, this whole unfinished constructions, they are becoming now the major centers for unsafe environment for women. And even the city like Mumbai, every day cases of sexual violence have been reported. Another issue she brought out was that whole anti-rape campaign that we have had, and the whole description of what was happening in Delhi at a ground level. One thing I think where she has played very important role, Dr. Umra, is a Saksham report. I think there should be wide publicity of Saksham report. It's such a rounded report. It's now available in PDF file. It came in response to Nirbhaya episode, gang rape in Delhi, and University Grants Commission appointed a committee of experts in which there were feminists like Uma Chakravarti, Mary John, Dr. Gopal Guru, and this report also talks about safety of women in public life, especially in educational institutions. Justice Verma committees, when Justice Verma committee was appointed, I think when the responses were given, there were many men have also responded to this issue, and in an extremely serious way. And only 2 issues for which I think our parliamentary debate were the most disappointing, where they said on marital rape and APSA, the level of debate that Indian Parliament had, I think it's extremely shameful. But I think at the response of the masses was very serious. She rightly said that land question has become a major bone of contention, and where women are paying a heavy price in terms of gang rape, whether it was a Nandigram or Singur or whatever the conflicts which are taking place in urban centers, wherever the land is grabbed for any mega development project. So even the testimonies of our friends in Narmada Bachao Andolan or in SEZ, everywhere I think
state as well as the local vested interests, they are using. Even in case of Priyanka Bhutmang, it was a question of land question, that the vested interests wanted to take this thing. And even for so-called implementation of Land Acquisition Act also, the sexual violence has been used. She brought out a very important issue of quote-unquote honor killing, custodial killing, what she said. And I think it is not only in Haryana and Punjab, throughout India it is happening. You ask young journalists in Gujarat, how do you survive? They said only about, by writing only about cuisine and garba. We don't write about such unpleasant things. It is happening in Tier 2, Tier 3 cities in a big way, and only thing there is a media blackout. It is about Haryana people are writing. So I think using children as a pawn in the power game, and especially for accumulation of power, prestige, and because all the marriages, as so-called arranged marriages, all other things are, and I think that there also we need to, and with this right-wing wave, whether it's the moral policing or this whole code of conduct, and in several places like Lucknow and Agra and this, even young boys and girls sitting together in a park or sitting next to each other in bus, that is also being objected by custodian of morality. I think we have to take it, and the younger generation is also giving rebuttal. So that's very, very important. What I would, the only feeling that sometimes you get, and especially mainly from the survivors of violence, that what is use of reporting, nothing will happen. And this kind of helplessness, I think the only answer we have is our sustained solidarity, keeping the issue alive. And I think both Anuradha Gandhi and Dr. Uma Chakravarti's life are a living example, the fighting spirit which conveys that रुके न जो, झुके न जो, दबे न जो, मिटे न जो, हम वो इनकलाब है, जुल्म का जवाब है, हर शहीद हर गरीब का हमें तो ख्वाब है. Now the floor is open for discussion.